Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Impacts of Soil Health Practices on the Hydrologic Processes. I'm Chris Boomsma, CEO here at the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. It's my privilege to start this webinar off before I hand it off to our moderator, presenter, and our panelists. So thank you for joining us today. And here we go. Just a few quick facts about CAST before we go too far along here. First of all, CAST, Council for Ag Science and Technology, is a 501c3 membership-supported nonprofit organization. This organization was formed in 1972 as a result of a 1970 National Academy of Sciences report. We pride ourselves on being nonpartisan, apolitical, science-based. Those are really the characteristics that we stick to in all of our work. We are a membership-supported organization, and that membership comes at both the individual level and also at the organizational level. So our members include scientific societies, universities, libraries, nonprofits, companies, and then many individuals. And we have both United States and international representation in our membership. And in 2022, we proudly celebrated 50 years of existence. On your screen now, you should see the mission and vision of CAST. I just want to talk about the mission, and that is to convene and coordinate networks of experts. You're going to see some of those experts today to assemble, interpret, and communicate credible, unbiased, science-based information to a variety of audiences, including policymakers, the media, the private sector, the public, and then many others could be listed, including scientists, leadership of various organizations, and the like. So that is our core mission here at the Council for Ag Science and Technology. How do we accomplish it, though? We accomplish our mission through the help of many volunteer contributors. We actually have a relatively small staff, but a lot of volunteers that support our organization. A variety of board members that are representing, again, scientific societies, companies, nonprofits, and universities. Many active task force members working on CAST reports that are yet to be released, and a variety of other volunteers that support our organization. Over the years, we've had many, many volunteers join our ranks and really advance the mission of CAST. So that is an introduction to CAST, the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. I'm now going to hand it over to today's moderator, Todd Peterson, and he's going to introduce both the topic at hand and the individuals that are involved. So with that, Todd, take it away. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. Again, Todd Peterson here. I am pleased to be able to introduce this topic and author to you. Briana Wyatt, an assistant professor at Texas A&M University, and she was the task force chair that pulled together work of a bunch of distinguished authors that contributed to and reviewed this paper. The paper concept has been around for several years now, but I'll go ahead and let Briana introduce herself and the topic. The topic, again, it's a CAST issue paper called The Impacts of Soil Health Practices on Hydrologic Processes. Briana?
Hi, everyone. My name is Briana Wyatt, and like Todd said, I'm an assistant professor at Texas A&M University, and I was the lead author on this paper titled The Impacts of Soil Health Practices on Hydrologic Processes. Next slide, please. So the motivation for this study came because when you think about soil health, typically you think of one of a few things. First, you usually think about how soil health improves crop yields, resiliency, and food security. Or you may also think about how soil health might be useful for counteracting climate change by sequestering greenhouse gases. However, there's another third very important impact of soil health practices, and those are the ways that it affects the hydrologic cycle. And typically, this third aspect doesn't get discussed very much, either in research or in the literature. And so we wrote this paper to address that lack of information on how soil health impacts hydrologic processes. Next slide. So before we jump into things, first we should say, what is soil health? What do we mean when we're talking about soil health? So soil health is defined by the NRCS as the continued capacity of the soil to function as a living, vital ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And this includes the capacity of the soil to filter contaminants, cycle nutrients, provide physical support for infrastructure and animal habitat, as well as regulating water movement. And of course, today we're going to be talking mostly about how it regulates water movement. Next slide. So I want to begin today with discussing water quantity and how soil health practices influence water quantity in each of the different components of the water cycle. So in front of you is a diagram showing the Earth's water cycle, and I've highlighted using these orange circles some of the key processes that we're going to discuss today. So we have, of course, rainfall that introduces water to the land, and then from there, that water can either be infiltrated into the soil or it can run off. Then we have the movement of that soil moisture to groundwater, or it might be taken up by plants via evapotranspiration. And of course, there's always agricultural water use as well as urban water uses. So we're going to talk about each of these things in turn. Next slide. So one of the driving factors that influences soil hydrology in terms of soil health practices is its influence on soil organic matter. So soil health practices tend to increase soil organic matter, which in turn increases the ability of the soil to retain water that it infiltrates. Figure 2 shows the results of a study that used soils from all over the United States, from Florida, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Kansas, to provide the first comprehensive evidence that increasing soil organic matter also increases soil water retention. And so because of this, we know that many of the benefits of these soil health practices stem from this increase in soil organic matter. Next. So when the rainfall hits the land surface, that is the very first impact in the hydrologic cycle. And soil health practices have been shown to increase aggregate stability, which influences the soil structure. For example, aggregate stability was found to be 34% higher in no-till systems than in conventional tillage systems. And this study is just one of many that have shown similar results. This increase in aggregate stability reduces soil loss due to rainfall impact. So that initial impact of the rainfall on the soil is lessened when we use these soil health practices. Next. So after that rainfall hits the soil, like I said, it has two options. It can either infiltrate into the soil or it can run off. When we talk about infiltration, typically what we see is that soil health practices improve the soil structure, and this improved soil structure leads to an increase in infiltration, which subsequently reduces the amount of surface runoff. This is one way of keeping the rain where it falls. These increased infiltration rates also lead to greater levels of soil water retention, as well as affecting habitats for microorganisms that live within the soil. Next. Once that water infiltrates into the soil, it continues to be redistributed throughout the soil profile. Typically, soil health practices lead to a lower bulk density and a greater water holding capacity than soils that have not undergone soil health practices. So in these systems, for example, where we use conservation tillage, we expect to see a greater amount of both water and air in those soils as compared to soils that are not undergoing soil health practices. Next. Finally, we have groundwater recharge. Soil moisture levels have been shown to regulate the movement of water into groundwater aquifers below. And this is because if there's moisture in the soil and gravity continues to pull that water downward, if that water isn't redirected or taken up by plants, it will continue to move downward until it reaches the groundwater table. However, most of the present studies about soil health practices and their impacts only focused on the very surface of the soil. Typically, these are limited to just the top 6 inches or that plow layer. And so there's really a research gap that we found when we dove into this subject, that right now there isn't really any conclusive research that shows what are the impacts of soil health on groundwater recharge. Next slide. So now we're going to transition from talking about water quantity to water quality and the impacts of soil health practices on water quality. So I begin my slides here with a side-by-side example of 2 fields that experienced the same rainfall event. This is a 4-inch rainfall event that happened in Illinois. And on the left-hand side, we have a field that underwent conventional tillage. And on the right-hand side, we have a field that underwent no-till management. And you can see very clearly from these pictures that the amount of soil and sediment that is lost from the conventionally tilled field is significantly higher, and the water quality is lower than that of the runoff from the no-till field. Next. So first I want to talk about surface water quality. This is any water that stands on the Earth's surface. Sediment itself, like we just saw in the previous picture, is the #1 source of surface water pollution in the United States. Soil health practices act to reduce the transport of that soil from agricultural fields by increasing the soil's strength, keeping the soil covered, as with cover crops or with crop residues, and then those same cover crops and crop residues act to reduce the velocity of runoff so that it limits the erosion itself. And sediments themselves are just sort of a primary detriment to water quality, but when those sediments reach their final destination, usually in a lake or a pond, they release all of the nutrients and the agricultural chemicals that they carried with them along the way, and those chemicals further degrade water quality. Next slide. One paper that covered 5 years of sampling found that 50% of surface water samples contained pesticide levels capable of causing negative health impacts either for humans or aquatic species. So this the issue of water quality is really a significant issue all over the United States. Next slide. In addition to surface water impacts, there are also impacts on groundwater quality. While we don't have good estimates of how soil health practices influence groundwater recharge rates, we do know that they can impact groundwater quality. We've seen that nutrient leaching losses from the bottom of the plant root zone can be reduced when using soil health practices as compared to conventionally tilled systems. Just one example of this was published in 2021, where a system that utilized both cover crops and no-till reduced nitrate leaching in the soil by approximately 20%. Next slide. So what does soil health have to do with climate change, apart from the potential to sequester greenhouse gases? Well, it has a lot to do with it. This figure shows mean annual global temperature anomalies. So this means how much higher or lower is the average annual temperature than it normally would be. So what we see is that in the past several decades, the air temperature of the Earth has been getting higher and higher, getting more and more above average. And this has significant impacts on the hydrologic cycle itself. Next slide. So what are some of those impacts? First, we expect to see an increase in evapotranspiration, an increase in precipitation intensity and variability, as well as an increase in surface runoff, including flooding. We expect to see a decrease in the amount of water that is stored in the soil, as well as a decrease in the amount of water that is recharging our aquifers. And all of these things interact together to result in a decrease in the amount of water that's available for plants, both native plants and agricultural crops. And we also expect to see an increase in the occurrence and the severity of natural disasters like severe weather, droughts, and floods. Next slide. This figure shows both the number of events on the left-hand y-axis, as well as the estimated cost on the right y-axis of natural disasters in the United States from 1980 through 2023. So you can see all the different types of disasters are occurring, but what you can also see here is that since approximately the year 2000, the number of these major costly disasters has increased significantly. And this has serious impacts. So what we expect to see in the future in terms of the impacts of climate change on agricultural production is that the results might be variable depending on where you live. So agricultural productivity is expected to decline in certain areas globally, but other areas, perhaps areas that previously weren't suitable for growing crops, might become suitable because of climate change. However, overall, the world's 3 major food crops, that is maize, wheat, and rice, are all expected to see yield declines in the future. Similarly, corn, soybean, and cotton yields are expected to decrease anywhere from 30 to 82%, depending on the level of warming that we experience in the future. We also expect to see an increase in both disease and pest pressure, as well as livestock heat stress. Next slide. But there is still hope. There's potential for these soil health practices to help us mitigate some of these negative impacts of climate change. For example, 1 acre-foot of soil can hold an extra 16,500 gallons of plant available water for every 1% increase in soil organic matter. So if we are able to properly manage our soils and increase the amount of organic matter in them, we should then be able to store more water in those soils to help, again, mitigate some of these impacts of climate change. Next slide. So what is the role of the private sector in adapting to climate change? The private sector can play many roles, including an encouragement of nature-positive water use, where we balance our conflicting demands for food, which everyone needs, as well as environmental quality. Everyone wants to live and work in an environment that is healthy. There are also opportunities for payments for ecosystem services, which provide both environmental and social benefits. Although these stimulus payments have shown positive impacts in certain cases. So one example is that land management activities like controlling pests and promoting conservation were increased by 50%. So 50% of people were willing to adopt these practices with this payment for ecosystem services. Next slide. We also have to talk about, if we're going to talk about the hydrologic cycle, we have to talk about the impacts of urbanization, as well as our just nationwide infrastructure and manipulation of hydrologic flow paths. So historically, we have modified the landscape to modify historical flow paths. So we're changing rivers, we're changing streams, and all of this has increased the peak discharge, so the maximum amount of water discharged because of a particular event. It's also led to an increase in erosion and mass wasting. We've lost most of the riparian areas, and this has also led to widespread soil degradation. One of the current challenges with our infrastructure is the fact that the majority of it is beyond its design lifespan. So most of these dams, levees, etc., are at the point where if they are stressed, like we expect them to be due to climate change, there is an increasing probability that these structures are going to fail. Next slide. One of the ways that can be used to mitigate this, particularly in urban areas, is using different types of green infrastructures. Things like are shown on the left-hand side, rain gardens or bioswales that capture excess runoff water from areas like parking lots, etc., and funnel that water into an area that is specifically designed to reduce the velocity of that runoff water, as well as filter harmful nutrients and chemicals out of that water before releasing the water to nearby streams. Another option is the use of what's called a green roof, where on the roofs of buildings we plant some vegetation and capture, again, keep the rain where it falls. Capture that rain on the roof before it becomes runoff down below, so that those plants are able to grow and reduce the likelihood of flooding. Next slide. There are also economic and social implications of whether or not we decide to adopt soil health practices. The cost of poor soil health on global food production has been estimated to range anywhere from $15 to $40 billion each year. The estimated global cost of soil degradation on lost agricultural production, impacts to infrastructure, and reduced air and water quality is estimated at $3 trillion every year. And typically what we see is that as humans, we prefer to trade short-term profit for long-term stability. We prefer to profit in the short term rather than perhaps have a little bit less profit now, but be more stable in the long term. We also are expecting to see an increase in both the economic and the personal cost of natural disasters in the future. Next slide. This figure shows the number of flood-related presidential disaster declarations by county for the years 1989 through 2022. We go hit the button one more time, there's an animation. So to summarize this figure, what we see is that 400 counties in the US over this 30-year period received 15 or more flood-related disaster declarations. And notice where most of those are located. Many of them are located in the eastern United States, but a lot of them are located right in the Midwest, where a lot of the agricultural production is happening. What this means is that many of these counties are receiving these major floods just about every other year during this 30-year flood period. So there's really a high level of potential for us to mitigate some of those impacts by implementing these soil health practices in these areas of high agricultural production. Next slide. So some of these economic and social impacts have been felt lately. So I included this photo. This was about a month ago now. This is flooding in South Texas due to some extreme rainfall events. And this flood event led to the death of a 4-year-old child who was swept away in the flood from his parents. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that they ever found him. There are 2 more photos here. You'll keep going forward. There we go. So we have, of course, impacts to livelihood, but also loss of property, cars, homes, just livelihood seriously impacted by things that may potentially be able to be mitigated by changing practices upstream. Next slide. So what are the implications of all of these things for policy and decision makers? Well, whatever solutions we come up with are going to require a combination of both stability as well as flexibility. So we have to have a happy medium between these two things. So we can potentially develop new policy mechanisms to support soil health practices. An example of this is the USDA's Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. And this was introduced or began last year with funding of $3.1 billion for 141 projects over more than 60,000 farms in the US. There's also the possibility of adjusting some of our existing policies. So these are things like the EQIP program, Environmental Quality Incentive Program, or the Conservation Reserve Program or Conservation Stewardship Program. So perhaps there's a way that we can adjust these existing policies to make them even more effective. Next slide. So in conclusion, we see that these soil health practices affect basically every single component of the hydrologic cycle. And they have potential to help mitigate the hydrologic impacts of climate change, such as increased flooding and drought. Sustainable soil health practices have to be supported by flexible yet stable policies that are developed through collaborations with producers themselves. Next. All right, and that is the end of my talk. And now I think we're going to transition to the panel discussion.
Yeah, Todd Peterson here again. Thank you, Briana. Dr. Wyatt will be joining us to answer questions. I'd also like to introduce the rest of our panel here. Is there a next slide? Oh, maybe not. Well, joining us on this panel is Dr. Jerry Hatfield, retired director of the USDA Lab for Agriculture and the Environment, and a well-known expert on agriculture and the environment. So also with us is Sean McMahon. Sean is out on his own, but recently left a 10-year stint at the Iowa Ag Water Alliance, where his organization's mission was to increase the scale and pace of farmer-led efforts to improve water quality. And finally, seventh generation producer Mitchell Hora, who also has a company called Continuum Ag here in Iowa that helps farmers both adopt and benefit in new ways from adopting soil health practices. So with that, I want to kick this off with a question. Well, I just thought about something as I was going over this material again, Briana, and you were doing a great job. But about 15 years ago, Tom Friedman, the New York Times author and Pulitzer Prize winner, addressed the American Society of Agronomy. And he said, "Don't worry about global warming, it's global weirding." That's what's happening to our climate. And actually looking at some of your paper figures in the paper, it is becoming more and more strange about how our climate is changing. So with that, I want to kick it over to Dr. Hatfield. Jerry, why do we care about soil health in the hydrologic cycle?
Well, that's always a question that we get asked by producers is why should I care about soil health in all of this? And it's pretty simple because water is probably the #1 factor that influences crop productivity, not only in the US, but around the world. And so anytime that we can increase the potential availability to water that crop, we see improved production, but we also see increased stability of yields among years, a number of those different things that go on. And just to kind of follow on what Briana is saying is that in terms of the changing climate out there is that we're seeing an increase across the Midwest, an increase in precipitation in the spring, as we're having this year. Delays planting, it saturates soils. But then we get more variability during the summer. And so anytime that we can increase the availability of water and increase water storage within that from two factors, one is reducing evaporation, the other is increasing the soil water storage, is that we can offset some of the variability of climate that we're seeing and variability of weather, I should say, within the growing season and everything. So that's kind of the short answer why producers care about it, because it relates to yield and it relates to profit.
Get me off mute. Thank you, Jerry. Sean, as I said, you just wrapped up about 10 years in an effort to engage an organization to help scale these practices up. What's standing in our way?
Well, one thing that we have that's really helping right now, Todd, is we've got record levels of federal funding for conservation, thanks to the Farm Bill, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. So just last year, NRCS hit record numbers of producers they're working with, record numbers of acres, and record numbers of contracts. We also have payments for ecosystem services, carbon markets that are still fairly new, but attracting billions of dollars of investment. And we've got new opportunities in terms of, again, the Inflation Reduction Act and payments for producers reducing carbon intensity. And there's really been, no shortage of opportunities. Historically, there has not been enough federal funding to meet farmer demand for conservation. In some years, there's been 8 times more farmers wanting to do conservation practices than what the federal government can pay for that. And that has now radically changed. So I am seeing a lot of opportunities to scale conservation practices. In Iowa, we went from having about 50,000 acres of cover crops in 2010 to about 3 million acres of cover crops in 2022. And so we're seeing adoption scale throughout the country. And because of the market payments now and cost share from the public sector, I'm really optimistic that we're on the cusp of an unprecedented scale up as we see more and more companies that will be looking to the ag sector for the source of solutions for climate and water quality. Hopefully we can start seeing more robust markets around water in addition to carbon. But while we have had success scaling in the last decade, I'm very bullish about the transformational progress we'll be making in the next decade.
Thanks, Sean. Now I want to kick this over to Mitchell, basically somebody who's been boots on the ground making this happen. Mitchell, what do you see from your perspective as a farmer and Continuum Ag's perspective on how do we increase the urgency here?
The number one thing that we always harp on that we have to do is that farmers have to see these soil health practices as offensive management tools, not just defense, right? We talked about a lot of problems that are out there with water quality, erosion, issues in the hydrologic cycle, all very, very true. But back to, and Jerry brought it up, to a farmer sometimes like, well, okay, but how's that impact me right now? I got to pay the bills this year. I got to pay back the bank. Interest rates are super high. I gotta pay the bills, So what we really teach farmers and how we approach these practices on our own farm is that they are offensive management tools. A couple examples of that. That cover crop is part of my nutrient stabilizer program. It's holding on to excess nutrients from last fall, and it's going to release them to me during this growing season after I terminate that cover crop. It's part of my pesticide program. It's suppressing weeds. I don't have to spend as much money on pesticides, especially residuals. We've reduced our pesticides by about 75% on our farm. Last year, our average pesticide cost was $18 an acre on both corn and soybeans. The stats on the fertilizer one, since I skipped over that, we've decreased our synthetic fertilizer usage by about 50% by, again, getting the soil to function correctly and utilizing that cover crop as part of the nutrient management and part of the fertilizer program. So I think that's really the key. It's a change of mentality that to a farmer, it's hard to quantify the ROI in some of these practices right away. But when you change it to directly line up with their P&L, it changes that mentality and it focuses them to have to think on the offensive side of things, get these practices done correctly, timely, so that they can maximize those positive ROI outcomes.
Well, thank you, Mitchell. I like that. changing a mindset to being more offensive. Even though these benefits take sometimes 5 to 7 years to really realize the accelerated benefits of soil health, it sometimes is difficult for producers to consider this as an offensive investment. At the same
And that's
time,
where we
we
like to
see.
get.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say there, Todd. That's where I'd like to see some base hits, right? The big gains, yeah, it takes time. But if you're looking at the right things, you can get some base hits. You can start seeing some weed suppression in year one. You can see some better nutrient cycling in year one. You can see some improved biological function and just overall biological activity in year one. A variety of different things. Yeah, aggregate stability, organic matter, some of these longer term water infiltration. That stuff's going to take a little bit of time. I like to start seeing some major gains, though, usually in year 3 to year 5, at least in some structure in the upper profile, some water infiltration. It does take patience for sure. It takes being diligent, and a lot of times it takes being creative and being innovative. But that's especially the innovation piece. Farmers typically do not have a lack of innovation, that's for sure.
Hey, Todd, just to amplify on Mitchell's piece of this, that in his talk on cover crops is that, we do see an immediate benefit on the water balance with cover crops because we do improve infiltration rates. We've reduced the evaporation rate. Always, one of the interesting pieces in this timeline is that we do see that water is the first thing to change when we begin to look at these soil health practices, because we are increasing cover crops, we're reducing tillage, and then we change the carbon piece, and then we change the nutrient piece. And so those are timescales from weeks to months to years in terms of this. And so producers have to realize that these cycles aren't all changing simultaneously. There's all these different pieces that come together in this. And I think this is a thing that over the winter, they need to sit and think about all the things that are going on in their fields and everything.
I'm reminded by our friend Neil Hamilton, who said he doesn't buy the fact that farmers are resistant or reluctant to invest, as he sees more tile going in and more farmers interested in adopting irrigation systems in formerly rain-fed areas. And he says, I don't buy that farmers are reluctant to make investments to improve the long-term productivity, but why aren't they doing it in soil health practices?
I suppose I could take that, Todd. So, it really comes back to ROI and what has been the value proposition that's been presented to producers. And for tiling or subsurface ag drainage, that pays off within 2 or 3 years and pays off very handsomely. So it's a very profitable practice. If you look at different conservation practices, some of them have really robust value propositions and great ROI. For instance, improving fertilizer use efficiency. Farmers have economic drivers where they're directly incentivized to see more of their fertilizer taken up by the crops and less loss to runoff and volatilization. So that economic incentive is built in, and we see huge rates of adoption there. In fact, we've seen farmers in the Corn Belt improve their NPK fertilizer use efficiency by over 100% since 1980. For other practices like we're talking about that can improve soil health and water quality, as we've heard from other panelists, they take a few years, and the value proposition is not as robust. In some cases, farmers will have yield drag, particularly if they fail to avoid certain rookie mistakes, like for cover crops, having the right termination window, having a plan for that, getting the right downforce pressure to plant through a dense mat. And so if farmers have yield drags and they, hear about some of their neighbors that have complained about that, they're really less likely to adopt those practices. Thankfully, we've seen really great research come out of the Soil Health Institute over the last couple of years that show that farmers in corn soybean rotations who are adopting cover crops and no-till they're actually going to see big yields over time big increases in ROI to the tune of about $40 per acre after 3 to 5 years. Now, if farmers are grazing cover crops, they'll see a profit in the first year. But it really differs based on conservation practice. But if you go to anyone, I don't care what field, and say, hey, we want you to invest in new expensive equipment. We want you to change the way you operate. If everything goes perfectly, maybe you'll get a 5% increase in profit. But if things don't go well, you might lose 30%. A lot of people aren't going to take that offer. So as we get better economics data, more and more farmers are jumping on this regenerative agriculture wagon, and we're seeing the uptake. But that value proposition is something we need to better quantify and better communicate to producers.
And Sean, I can share our story along those lines. That you're exactly right. When we first jumped into cover crops about 10, 12 years ago now, we made all those rookie mistakes, right? We didn't know what the heck we were doing. And a lot of those technical services, those advisors, they're not near as robust as they are today. The material that's out there on the internet today, the resources that are there, the events in this space didn't exist 12 years ago, at least not to this extent when we started jumping in. And my family jumped into using no-till clear back in 1978, but making this jump to use cover crops was tough. And in year one, we lost 20 bushel the acre, which, was a huge, huge loss. And especially as you're talking, even today's economics, that would be real detriment. Luckily, we tried it on a small scale. We determined that it was us. We didn't adjust the planter correctly. We didn't understand our carbon to nitrogen ratio. We didn't adjust our fertilizer, our pesticides, nothing. We just threw it out there, planted corn into way too big a cereal rye. Now today we do it with massive success. This year we planted a ton of corn into green, headed out cereal rye that was an average of 5 foot tall, and having tremendous success planting our cash crops green into a cover crop. But in year one, we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't make the right adjustments. We've learned from that. Now we're having tremendous success. One last thing is to sum this whole thing down on why are we not seeing more adoption. In my perspective, it boils down to two major categories. Farmers are worried about the logistic risk of change and the economic risk of change. We talked about some of the economics already. Sean did a great job too of speaking to that. If you screw this stuff up, you can lose a lot of money. And it costs money to change too. These cover crops are expensive. Changing practices, some of this equipment, if you don't have it, the time to do it, it can be expensive. And if you lose yield, it could just compound the pain. But also the logistic risk of change. How do I do it? What cover crop? How do I manage it? How do I control it? How do I change my equipment? What's going to work or not in my area? It's all so nuanced. But really, I think boils down to those two things: logistic risks and the economic risks. They very much go together, but I think we're addressing those more and more, and that's why we're seeing an uptick. But it all boils down to those two categories in my experience.
Thanks, Mitchell. So I want to broaden the discussion a little bit. A lot of the benefits from these soil health practices are indicated by better water quality from water leaving the farm field, as well as the reduced risk of downstream flood damage. How do we connect urban residents with the need to engage in their watershed to help accelerate the use of these practices? And it's really for the benefit of everyone, not just the farmers involved.
So I could take a first swipe at that, Todd. We are seeing in Iowa cities like Des Moines and Cedar Rapids really step up and start to invest in farmer and landowner practices that keep water on the landscape longer. And so whether that's wetlands or no-till or cover crops, we're starting to see these great partnerships emerge with the cities partnering with upstream communities and farmers and ag associations and conservation organizations. City of Cedar Rapids is really a great example where they had those devastating floods that cost tens of billions of dollars in 2008. And they decided that for a small investment, they're going to work with farmers upstream, not only to improve water quality, which helps their source water utility, but to reduce flood risk by keeping water on the landscape longer. And so having more conservation practices that improve soil health, of course, as Briana pointed out, that increases the water retention capacity of the soil, and that can take the peaks off of flood events like we've seen in Iowa and Texas and throughout the country, which of course are just getting more severe as climate change impacts are exacerbated and we're seeing more frequent, more intense rain events.
Yes, more frequent, more intense rainfall events, but actually we're getting warmer and wetter, and we're actually having more periods of drought in between those intense rainfall events. So it's a something that farmers recognize is changing, but they need to understand that this is a way that we can help improve that resiliency in light of a changing climate. So
Todd, one thing that really struck me in Brianna's presentation was the slide about the current impact, the financial impact of the status that we're in today. I thought I hadn't seen some of that data before, and I think we double click into that. That's ultimately what's going to get everybody on the same page. What's the cost of change versus that cost of staying the same? And some of that data there, when you're talking $3 trillion was the note, like, geesh, as you put that to an individual or to a company or whatever, you're talking serious money that you'd be much better investing upstream, like in Sean's examples, and you could be money ahead, just simply taking it to the economics. So that was something that really struck me that I think needs double tapped into and share that story to a much broader audience.
A couple of questions coming in on the Q&A section. We have, how can we help extension personnel improve their communication on the benefits of conservation? I'd say that we're seeing a lot more interest from land-grant universities, both in teaching and in outreach and education, and events like this, and the things that you, Sean, and Mitchell participate in. I mean, Mitchell, you must do all outreach, it seems, based on how many places I see you.
I've done a lot of speaking gigs, and we just hosted an event here in Southeast Iowa on Monday, had about 400 folks in attendance and nice broad array of different people. But I think it is just, encouraging them to get out of the office, get on the farm, right? Learning from folks who are having success, but also learning from folks who aren't, and folks that are deep into this and have been at these practices for a long time, but also folks that are new to these practices. I think they need to get a diverse array of insight. But really it boils down to what I always harp on with extension or NRCS employees or the like. It's that offense, not defense. The impacts that we're talking here in the report and all that, super important. But to a farmer, those short-term items of cutting fertilizer costs, cutting pesticide costs, cutting fuel cost, maintaining yield resiliency, managing moisture from an offensive perspective, I think that's really the key thing that they need to be spreading the message about.
And again, some of the most effective outreach activities involve farmer-to-farmer information transfer, that they trust what comes from another farmer. So
and that's ultimately what we want to hear from, right? But I think those extension or NRCS employees can help with that, right? Not just saying, hey, here's what the book says, but also, hey, here's what Sean's doing over on his farm, or somebody telling Jerry what I've got going on mine. Like, it's that kind of sharing stories. I think that's really good. Then, of course, back it up with the hardcore science as well.
But just let me interject in that, because I think there's a lot of utility in, as Mitchell talked about the soil health event last Monday, there's a lot of communities of producers that show up at those, that they're neighbors of each other. They kind of feed off each other. I think the regenerative agriculture is bought out, and all of this, the neighbor to neighbor sharing and talking about what successes they've had in a much more local scale. So it's not somebody 300 miles away that says, well, this works. It's somebody that's across the fence or down the road that they identify with very carefully. And I think that this has really helped a lot of this effort move forward, is that these what I call the neighbor to neighbor communities of just sharing information.
Yeah, if I could just add a minute to that. So, one example that really drives home Jerry's point is the adoption of no-till in Argentina, where remarkably 93% of row crop acres are in no-till. That's a little more than double of what we have in the US. And a big reason for that was these farmer to farmer, peer to peer networks where they helped each other tackle some of the technical challenges of no-till. I'd like to see us invest in that in the United States. Todd, you mentioned trusted advisors, and extension is definitely up there on the list, but the highest organization on the list for most trusted advisors, those are actually the sales agronomists. I think in the US, through our public sector extension, whether that's NRCS, FSA, state ag departments, and land grant universities, we've done a good job getting to the early adopters, the innovators, but we're really going to need the private sector and the ag retail sector in particular to get to those middle and late adopters. And one new model that's really taken off in Iowa and throughout the Corn Belt in the last 5 years is that of the conservation agronomist, where you take a sales agronomist or certified crop advisor, train them up on conservation and regenerative ag practices, and then they become dedicated just to conservation. And they serve as a force multiplier for the other farmer-facing sales agronomists. They get them up to speed on conservation practices. And we've really seen that move the needle in a short amount of time in Iowa. And so I hope that that model gets more broadly adopted, because in order to really improve soil health and water quality, we need to get to scale. And we've got to get to those middle and late adopters, and we've got to work with the private sector to do that effectively in the US.
I'm going to share one story that really is yours, Jerry. A farmer asked you at a speaking event, how do I know if I have healthy soil? And your reply was spot on. It was, well, let's go walk in your field together after a 2-inch rain. And this farmer said, well, I can't walk out of my field after a 2-inch rain. I'll only make it 20 yards and the mud will stick to my feet. And you said, okay, let's go to another one of your neighbors. and I mean, the difference is after, several years of soil health practices, the hydrologic changes are so striking that you really can walk in a field right after a 2-inch rain. So we just have to have more of those experiences to share.
Todd, I'd like to interject one thing, and that's a fact. As we begin to improve the hydrologic piece of this, is that we do see an increase in field uniformity of yields. We've saw that on Wayne Frederick's farm with analyzing that. I actually saw it on Mitchell's farm when I went through all the data that he and his dad gave me to process and everything, is that the fields become more uniform. And if you can take the low yielding spots out, it increases profitability. And it's all due to the water dynamics that are going on and the climate resilience. And so why this becomes important is one little factoid is that we do see across the Midwest that the lower average county yields are associated with high rainfall during the April and May period, and that the higher county average yields are associated with higher than normal July and August rainfall. But on Wayne's, where we begin to improve that system over time, we didn't see that correlation anymore. And so there's the advantage of being able to offset some of the climate signals that are going on in all of this. And you see more and more producers that have adopted these practices tell me those stories, that they can plant earlier, they can traffic across that. It's like your 2-inch, walking out in the 2-inch rain field. Well, if you could traffic in the field this time of year, you'd have your beans and corn planted. You wouldn't be struggling to get in right now. So I think these are things the message is we need to get across to producers that changing your hydrology, influencing your soil has these impacts, but you can't just treat it as one event. You've got to look at it as a whole system of how you manage that overall farm.
And we're absolutely seeing that benefit. And a fun time where I had our Iowa Secretary of Ag, Mike Nag, out the day after one of those 2-inch rainfalls. And yeah, we walked right out there on the field. He had his fancy shoes on, Mike's always dressed to the nines. And he came out with no mud on his boots at all. And seeing exactly that. It's my understanding that the current national average water infiltration rate is about 1/2 inch of infiltration per hour.
Correct.
On our farm, the last time we did water infiltration testing, we can infiltrate 4 inches of rainfall in under 5 minutes. So instead of 1/2 inch per hour, we're doing 4 inches in under 5 minutes. We can take in a 1-inch rainfall in 6 seconds on our farm. So whether it be too wet, too dry, we're seeing exactly like Jerry's talking. And as we're discussing this whole event, we're seeing it. And last year, we only had 6 inches of rain total on our farm. And we still did not take any federal crop insurance. We have not had a crop insurance claim, and I believe we're on now year 6. This year we're wet, or the last couple of years we've been wet, and we've got everything planted, and it looks great. We were just out there digging around here before. I'm out at the farm right now, and things look awesome out there, and we're sitting good. So it's really avoiding that risk.
That's a great way to wrap this up, as soil health practices really do impact hydrologic processes. So that's the title of the paper. There is one question before I turn this back over to Chris. There is one question on how do we download this paper that we're talking about today. So with that, Chris, thank you for panelists for participating, Sean, Jerry, and Mitchell, and Briana, and great job. And now I'll turn this over to Chris and wrap things up.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate that. And I appreciate all the participants today. It's been a great panel discussion, great presentation. A lot of folks put a lot of effort, not only into the webinar today, but the paper. And as I said before, we are very dependent on these great volunteers here at CAST. So thank you for the work, everyone. Regarding the paper, you can find it at CAST website. Very easy. You just do a search, even just a Google search will do it, or some other search browser. Simply CAST, Soil Health and the Hydrologic Cycle. It'll come up. It'll be made available to everybody, and it's free of charge. Everything that CAST produces is free of charge. So please be on the lookout for it, read it, enjoy it. And of course, I'm sure you can contact any of the participants today and ask questions. Obviously, you got some great experts here available. With that, I just want to briefly talk about some other things that are coming from CAST and show what has been done more recently. We've published a number of papers as of late. RNA interference was one of them earlier in the year. We talked about the next plant invasion and avoiding it. Genome-edited crops were discussed, FIFRA, ESA, and the pesticide consultation process, and just now, soil health and the hydrologic cycle. You can find all these papers, again, available on our website. Also, upcoming papers. You might have heard of some of these hot topics. Highly pathogenic avian influenza. We're going to be talking about biofuel regulations, precision irrigation and AI, and about algal blooms. So a lot to come from CAST still this year. So be on the lookout for those resources coming your way. Lastly, we always encourage folks to contact us if you are interested in some of our papers and can't find them. Reach out. You can see the website, phone number on the screen at this time, and our email address. Follow us, please, on social media. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. Please follow us so that you are aware of the resources that are coming out and are made available to you. And lastly, we'd love to have you join CAST. You can see a QR code on the screen at this time. You can look at that with your phone, and hopefully you can join us in all the work that we're doing. We certainly appreciate your support as it helps us fulfill our mission. Again, thank you everyone for your work today on this paper. I deeply appreciate it. Thank you everyone for joining. We hope you have a wonderful day and a great growing season. Take care. Bye-bye.